Co-author of the international bestseller Platform Revolution, he's one of the world's experts on network business models, whose research has received numerous academic awards. Please welcome to the stage, Marshall van Alstyne.
Welcome to the Accenture Ignite Conference. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to say, having attended a number of conferences, this has some of the most interesting ideas and no doubt some of the best music of any conferences I've attended. So we have to thank William and others for helping to organize this. What I'd like to do is to tell us some stories. And I want to do it in the context of three separate ideas. One of these ideas is that we are now seeing structural changes in the economy. This is not just cloud, it's not just social, it's not just analytics. We're about to see some structural changes in the economy that are going to be quite profound. In fact, I want to make the claim that the changes in the economy that we see in the internet era are as profound as the changes as we saw in the industrial era, but it's for the opposite reason. I want to give you the data for this, and then I want to give you the reasons why it's happening. If we understand the reasons, then we can also do the analysis and so what the implications are. How does this change strategy? How does this change marketing? How does this change operations? So let's start with some of the data. What can you learn from this chart? What things can you pick up? Here we have Uber has now passed BMW in estimated market value. It's a century-old company in the case of BMW, 116,000 employees, and yet Uber with only 12,000 is worth more in the private equity markets. Or how about Airbnb? It has now passed Marriott in valuation with less than 1/10 of the employees. Or better still, how about Walt Disney? We watch Walt Disney movies, our kids know it as iconic culture, and yet Facebook, with 1/10 of the employees, is worth twice as much as Walt Disney. Walt Disney hires the world's best choreographers, videographers, and yet you and I create the content for Facebook. So what's happening? Or if we look at a true industrial era firm, Kodak, which was appeared in the very beginning, was 1888, invented consumer photography. In its heyday, worth $30 billion, 145,000 employees. And yet Instagram sold for $1 billion with only 13 employees. What's happening? If we look at the differences in employment ratios, in the value creation and the speed, something is different. This data is 2 weeks old. These are the most famous companies in the world. Every October, Interbrand puts out a list of the most famous companies, and there are Asian brands on here, Toyota, Honda. There are European brands, BMW, IKEA, and others, American brands like Apple and Google and others. Until 3 years ago, the most famous company in the world was Coca-Cola. The numbers up here represent their brand equity value or the growth in that value. If you separate out these companies, by which of them has an external ecosystem, this many are platform companies, and almost the entire row are platform companies. What about presence on the internet? Well, unsurprisingly, this is overwhelmingly dominated by platform companies. It's Google, it's Facebook, it's Alibaba in North America. If we look in Latin America, it's the same thing. In Africa, it's the same thing. If we look in China, it is Alibaba, it's Tencent, it's Baidu. It's interestingly enough, it's predominantly Chinese and US companies. We have to figure out what's actually going on. This is a listing of the most valuable companies in the world. What's interesting is when we started collecting this data 5 years ago, three of the top companies were platform companies. Now it's 7 of the top 10 companies are platform companies. And this has been going on since the turn of this century. In fact, the story has been, at the turn of this century, it was dominated, as in most cases, by energy and banking. And again, 5 years later, energy and banking. 5 years later, energy and banking. Today, it's all platform companies as the dominant firms in terms of market capitalization. These are just some of the data. One of the claims I want to make is that the product business model is broken. Anyone have a BlackBerry? Anyone willing to admit you have a BlackBerry? BlackBerry has been some interesting challenges, okay? It was fascinating that in 2009, they had half the market. It was 49%. And yet 4 years later, they had only 2%. That's hard to do. right? You don't want to be the managers, the executives leading that charge. But the other thing I want to draw your attention to is consider the shape of this curve. It's convex down. There's a feedback process here working against the BlackBerry, but working for Apple and Google. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But it's not fair to just pick on BlackBerry. We need to examine other companies as well. We look back historically. What happened to Apple? This represents the market capitalization of Apple in red and Microsoft in blue. And again, we see the exponential growth for Microsoft, where Apple nearly went bankrupt. Why? It was too closed. It didn't build an ecosystem. Apple had the better product. Microsoft had the better ecosystem. We're going to see if we can actually tease out this lesson in a number of different ways. One of the mistakes is to assume this is only technology companies. Lots of companies are now trying to do this. If we go back to the most famous companies and look at those that are still in process of transformation, there are many other companies. In particular, we start to look at BMW and Mercedes. GE is introducing its Predix system to actually do controls in nuclear power plants and in jet engines. Or take a look at Nike. We'll take a look at it in just a moment. Starting with Daimler, they're now moving into the platform economy. They're adding community and information where you can actually build on the ecosystem and rent space in the vehicles, as with Uber. Or you can compare ecosystems. If you want to compare walking or biking or taxis or other systems, gathering that data in one place as an interface around it. Shoes. Nike is adding information and community. With the apps, you can now track your performance, benchmark your health, and see how you're doing. In fact, they're building out so that teams can compare their performance against other sports teams. You can compete against yourself over time, or you can help your community get better and have your team get better at its sports performance than the competing teams. One of the better examples is actually McCormick Spice. How would you build a platform around salt and pepper? Unusual accomplishment. McCormick did it. In fact, they added these two ingredients of information and community. They used their research labs to be able to do a recommender system. So they can ask you, do you like licorice or mint or garlic or cinnamon? From that, they can recommend a series of recipes that meet your taste and are liked by your teenage kids who might not necessarily want their vegetables. What's interesting is that the community can download these recipes, tweak them, and then re-upload them. Notice what's just happened. The community is creating valuable information for other members of the community. They've added additional feedback or additional benefit. It's this combination of ideas and information based in the community that helps to add value. How is the column on the left related to the column on the right? We have Android developers, Android users. We have Tesla charging station, Tesla car drivers, Airbnb rooms, Airbnb renters, Autodesk developers, Uber drivers, Uber riders. How are these related to one another? There's feedback here. Each side attracts the other. Notice that Uber riders attract Uber drivers, Airbnb hosts attract Airbnb guests, Android developers attract Android users. The second point, essentially, all of these are outside the organizations themselves. These aren't assets owned by Uber or Google or Autodesk or eBay. They're assets outside the organization. We'll come back to that. But this feedback is essentially the ingredient that we see in all of these hockey stick growth percent. It's not just a Bath diffusion model. It is users creating value for users. Users creating value for users in Skype, in an Airbnb, in Uber, in Kickstarter. Each of these things is a feedback process. Notice when it was working against BlackBerry. In this case, working for the platform company. Why does this matter? I want to go back and support this claim that the giants that we're going to see today exactly resemble the giants of a century ago, but for the opposite reason. So let's be clear what we mean by this. What giants did we see a century ago? We saw them in electricity in the United States and in Germany. We saw them in automotive in the US and Europe. We saw them in steel and in oil and in chemistry and in railroads. These are all supply-side economies of scale. Massive fixed costs, low marginal costs. Your cost for your first watt of electricity is extremely expensive. Your cost for your second watt is extremely inexpensive. Or railroads. You have to get rights of way. You have to lay track. You have to build the locomotives. Your first railroad shipment is extremely expensive. The second one's extremely inexpensive. This creates a feedback process where if you get scale, you can lower your price, drive out competition, which gives you more scale, which allows you to down price and drive out more competition. What are we seeing in the internet economy? Microsoft still has better than 85% market share in desktop. Alibaba, 80% market share in e-commerce in China. Android just hit 87% market share in mobile. Facebook, 2 billion users. That's almost a third of the world's population. Amazon has 2/3 of book sales online, digital and physical. And YouTube, 77% of online views. It's extraordinary what these organizations are able to achieve. Another name for a network effect of users creating value for users is a demand-side economy of scale. Notice this is the opposite side of the profit equation. This is why I say it's a structural change. It's not just on the supply side, we're moving the cost curve down. What we're doing is we're moving the value curve out. As you get scale, users create value for users, so you attract users, which creates more value, which attracts more users. This is why we get a feedback that leads to these gigantic firms. And it's interesting, we see this emergence largely in North America and in Asia, and we have to build more of them here in Africa and also in Latin America. We need to see if we can actually get more of these economies of scale building from communities. All of the growth seen so far in these other large homogeneous markets. This leads us to some very interesting differences in what we teach. So I teach in a business school. One of the most interesting things is that almost everything we teach in the business school is now affected and inverted. Everything needs to change. Whether this is marketing or operations or logistics or finance, all of these things. The reason is you cannot scale network effects inside a corporation as easily as outside the corporation. There are simply more people outside the organization. So let's give you examples. These are the implications that we're going to want to manage. I'll start with marketing because I can use the words or the slides of the original giant in marketing, who was Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola pointed out they've evolved over 4 decades. So this is their slide, from single message to segmentation, to individual targeting, and now to virality or social influence. I can take Coca-Cola's slides and overlay on top of it a new set of vocabulary that comes from marketing, which is the push or outbound messaging, which is done by the firm, and now the pull or inbound messaging, which is done by the user base. Some fascinating evolution and strategies are done by, how many of you get Warby Parker glasses in fashion? A beautiful example where they will ship you pairs of glasses and ask you to post photos of yourself online to social networks. This is genius. First, your friends get to vote on which fashions really do look good on you, or which don't. The second is you are implicitly pushing the Warby Parker brand. The users are propagating viral growth and propagating the name of the company. It's remarkable how we flipped it and the users are creating that value. In operations and logistics, we're going to move from a supply chain to something fundamentally different. They teach in business schools Porter's value chain. The value chain is inbound logistics, operations, outbound logistics, and marketing. And we can represent this schematically as a pipeline. Take Coca-Cola. They take sugar, they add water, they add caramel flavoring, and they add lots of branding, and they get that to the market. You're adding value at each stage to this value-adding process overall. It's not how platforms work. What platforms do is they take the production and consumption and they lift them off the platform. In this case, the supply and the demand are outside the platform. Now, what we do is we engage in curation. We'll take the best content, we'll select it, and we'll pass it on to the user base. So we'll take the good rides on Uber and keep them on platform. We'll take the good apps in the App Store and keep those on platform, or the good rooms on Airbnb and keep those on platform. Again, we take the gold and keep that on, and we take the coal and push that off the platform. And it's not all or nothing. There's a spectrum of these different business models. At the left are the pipeline traditional business models. That's Coca-Cola, producing stuff and getting it to market. At the right is a pure platform play. They have, all Airbnb and Uber are just platforms. But if we look at Apple or Samsung, they make things, they make phones, they make appliances, and they add a layer on top that creates these ecosystems. Most businesses will probably be somewhere in that middle. Notice, by the way, that Airbnb has now scaled to more than 40,000 listings in Paris alone. It's impossible that Marriott or Intercontinental or any of these other hotels could have done that. The capital costs alone would kill you. It's a beautiful quote that comes out of Silicon Valley, noticing that Airbnb doesn't own its own rooms, Facebook doesn't make its own content, Uber doesn't own its own cars, Alibaba doesn't own its own inventory. There's something fascinating here. Notice that they have shed even the marginal costs of production. Go back to that slide earlier on. Uber founded in 2009, Airbnb in 2008. No wonder they are staggeringly fast. If they don't even incur the marginal costs of production, they can grow incredibly fast. They can come, apparently, from nowhere. Something else that changes. Let's take finance. Usually we'll value the assets of the corporation. Now we have to value the assets of that external community. I like to start with a debate that took place only in 2014, ages ago. Right? One of the finance professors at NYU, who's written textbooks on finance, was wondering, why is it that the venture capitalists were dropping $1.7 billion on a firm which at that time only had a few hundred million in revenue? It made no sense. They did the traditional discounted cash flow analysis and estimated the firm couldn't be worth more than $5.9 billion. He said, this is absurd. And he did something very classic. He said, if you disagree with me, here's my spreadsheet. Go run your own numbers. Someone who did disagree with him was Bill Gurley, the lead investor at Uber. And he said, that's all good, but you're forgetting Brian Arthur's work on network effects and others. Here's a napkin sketch from the COO of PayPal. Uber riders attract Uber drivers, attract riders, attract drivers. We get this feedback going. Once this feedback happens, you get this nonlinear growth and you get better coverage. Now what happens? After you get this, you can actually not just go over to the taxi market, then we can actually go after the rental car market. So Hertz or Avis or other rental cars are in the radar. After that, we can start to go after the second car replacement market. So you can rather than having to own a car, you could actually call one. Now you're going after Ford and GM and Toyota. And after that, you can go after the logistics market. So now you're going after the logistics companies. Notice what's happened. The boundaries of the industry have changed. That demand curve has moved. It's not just taxis. We've then moved into rental cars, then to automotive, and then to logistics. We have moved those boundaries. Also, he had data. He noticed that the market size for taxis in Uber in San Francisco from 2009 to 2014 had already changed by a factor of 3. If you take Damodaran's number, 5.9, multiplied by 3, you're at 17, which was the correct valuation. Damodaran had simply not included the network effects and missed that as an opportunity. Consider another interesting example. Everyone thought it was absurd that Facebook paid $1 billion for 13 people. It's not the 13 people. It's the 30 million users. You can almost do these numbers in your head. $1 billion, 30 million users, $33 a person. It turns out now that was a bargain. It's now $40 or $50 per person. We're having to value the community, the assets outside. Another fun example of this information content by others. He goes to the moon and takes 5 photos. They go to the bathroom and take 37. See if you can anticipate these giant bursts in information and growth and position yourself at that nexus, and you'll be able to capture and monetize it the way Instagram has. How about human resources? We need to shift from internal employees to harnessing the wisdom of crowds. It was the case that we taught in human resource management that there was hierarchy. Then information technology allowed us to flatten the organization, and then one person could manage multiple people. Now, it's flipping outside the organization. Now we are getting cloud labor. We can get freelance. We can get others outside, and yet contracting for the work still allows the intellectual property to go to the corporation. And you can get performance evaluation down to the individual and team level, even across projects outside the organization. Productivity has grown dramatically as a result of this. Consider the productivity of a workforce amplified by ideas and others outside the organization. And would you rather have the expertise of one travel agent or 10,000 people who've reviewed the hotels and the vacation packages? Would you rather pay for a lawyer at $3.50 an hour or get a dozen lawyers answering your questions for free? It's an extraordinary shift in the business model and the allocation of expertise. R&D and innovation is especially salient. If you capture the innovation outside the organization, you can actually grow the crowdsourcing, some of the ideas presented earlier this morning. I'd like to start with Mark Andreassen's observation about what a platform does. A platform is a system that can be adapted to the needs and niches not anticipated by the original designers. We can illustrate it for fun with a historical industrial example. You need the product to be modular, so that it can be reassembled and reused. So what's one of those first modular consumer products? A Ford Model T. The Ford Model T could be disassembled by users and remade into hay carriers, flour mills, race cars, mobile churches, snowmobiles, sawmills, and goat carriers. Each of these things were innovations not conceived by Henry Ford, but were brought to the ecosystem. What we need to do is to capture that external innovation. We need to open. This is a plot of the accesses to MySpace in red, and they should have won, versus Facebook in blue from 2004 to 2008. Anyone know what this first bump is here in 2006? Yes, correct. They opened from .edu to .com. So they went from just colleges to industry. Excellent. The next portion, however, how about this region of convex growth? What happened there? This is where they opened to external developers. This is when Zynga brought them Mafia Wars and Farmville and poker. Social gaming caused people to start spending hours on platform, inviting their friends in. This made it more attractive for other developers, which made it more attractive for users to come spend in it. A beautiful quote is summarized in Business Week from the founder of MySpace. We tried to create every feature in the world and said, okay, we can do it. Why should we let a third party do it? We should have taken 5 to 10 key features and let the ecosystem innovate on everything else. What mistake had MySpace made? The exact same mistake Apple had made in the 1980s and 90s. They did not open their ecosystem and invite other parties in. It's a remarkable shift. You need to own the assets at the top of the distribution. If this is Windows, you own Word, PowerPoint, and Excel. If this is your phone, it comes preloaded with contact maps and other things on it that the ecosystem owner wants to own. But you don't need to own everything else. You want the ecosystem to bring you all this extra value. In fact, if you add up in your head the value from there all the way over to there, the ecosystem value created by third parties can dwarf the value created by the firm itself. You must open if you want to innovate. To represent it in a different way, suppose this is the ecosystem, this is the value your own firm creates on the slope. Now what I want you to do is to open your ecosystem such that third parties help you out. Now, you can start from behind, start from a lower value proposition. If this is time, this is value added over time, you can overtake the leader because your slope is higher. It's a mathematical certainty. If you innovate at a faster pace than the lead product, you must overtake. This is another reason why platforms always win. The last point to make from this is, what is your cost of failure if a given app fails? Almost zero. You did not bear that cost of experimentation. But what's your cost on the upside if a given app like Angry Birds succeeds? In that context, you've got the option on the upside, and yet you've shed the costs of failure. It's an innovation ecosystem that experiments at a much more efficient pace from the perspective of the firm. One of the biggest changes is strategy. Paul did a beautiful job of summarizing some of the strategy issues from Porter. The goal is going to shift from creating entry barriers and differentiation to more valuable market exchanges. The story that we like to use for this is, what was the world like in 2007? At the time, the handset manufacturers, 7 firms controlled 99% of industry profits. By all the classic tenets of strategy, they were unassailable. They had entry barriers based on economies of scale. They had famous brands like Nokia and Samsung, LG and BlackBerry. They had regulatory protection through the telecommunications companies, world-class logistics and global sales. Nokia alone had spent $40 billion in research. But they're all building products, not platforms. 6 years later, all but one were losing money, and one firm controlled 92% of industry profits. That was Apple. The CTO of Nokia likes to ask, is it the case that all 7 incumbents were clueless, or had something changed? We like to argue that, in fact, the business model has changed. Introducing a platform business model makes a difference. I won't summarize as much because Paul did a beautiful job earlier, but the classic goals of strategy are creating barriers to entry for competitors. You want cost leadership so you can afford low prices, or product differentiation so you can justify high prices in there, right? And you own the inimitable resources. That's not how platforms work. Platforms want as much engagement as possible. What would I tell you earlier that the other companies did? You had information and community. The more engagement you get on the platform, the better off you are. Notice the branding slide I showed you earlier. Google spends less on advertising than Coca-Cola, but it's a better known brand because you engage with it on a day-to-day, moment-by-moment basis. It's that engagement that brings you the network effects, which brings you the barriers to entry. The boundaries are also indistinct. You can ride with Uber today and drive with them tomorrow. You can stay with Airbnb and then host with them tomorrow. You can be a customer on Salesforce and then you can actually create apps for Salesforce. Each of these things allow you to shift the boundaries. And oh yes, even competitors can be allowed into your ecosystem under the right terms. Amazon and Microsoft are into the Apple and Google ecosystems under the right terms. Your competitors can be complementers if you know what you're doing. And in fact, one of the things that I really want to get, and competition here is multi-layered. In this context, it's not just Google versus Amazon, or Apple, or Microsoft versus Nintendo. That's platform on platform. You also want to think of your ecosystem partners. Here, you want to make sure that your ecosystem partners bring you value. So Facebook wants Zynga on its platform. It does not want Zynga on the MySpace platform. Microsoft does want Electronic Arts on its gaming system, and it doesn't want Electronic Arts on the Nintendo gaming system. You want your ecosystem partners to mono-home as opposed to multi-home. You then must manage whether your partners are interacting in a healthy way or not. Are your users exploiting other users? So when Zynga started spamming its users to try to get more people onto its platform, Facebook shut off the apps. eBay guarantees certain of the transactions. You need to make sure the interactions are healthy among the players. And then you also have to make sure the interactions with the partners relative to the platform are also healthy. So if your ecosystem partners try to take the relationships away, that's when you have to watch out. When Google Maps takes the relationships away from Apple, that's dangerous. When Zynga takes the relationships away from Facebook, that's dangerous. Chess is three-dimensional in the platform world. It's a much more complex game. I want to give you one other insight here about predicting entry more precisely. Most firms predict their competitors based on features. That defines your industry. What I want you to think about instead is who's the community and who has the stronger relationship with that community. The dangerous entrants are those that have a community and a stronger relationship to those. So, for example, if you enter with a stronger community, then your ecosystem can pull them away. We had a marvelous example earlier of Garmin and TomTom being crushed by the Apple mapping service from Google added onto the Apple ecosystem. Right? Their network growth is your network erosion. When Apple and Google grew, that's what eroded on BlackBerry. The idea here is that this is a critical insight. Let's see if we can tease out the deeper principle. The technology itself is unnecessary if an ecosystem partner can provide it. To use that Google mapping example, Apple didn't have to build a map, Google provided it. Or to give another example, I can provide A perfect example of an HP calculator that I can get for $2. Apple didn't make it, and neither did HP, but yet it wipes out the sales on the mapping device. The insight here, the deeper principle, it's easier to add a technology to a community than it is to add a community to a technology. I'll say it again, it's easier to add a technology to a community than to add a community to a technology. The company that owns the platform, that has that tight relationship to the community, is deadly dangerous because they can add your technology via an ecosystem partner. If we look at strategy of the classic world, you focus on distinct buyers and suppliers, substitutes, entrants. You focus on core competencies, supply-side economies of scale, and you own those inimitable resources. Cost leadership and product differentiation. You have barriers to entry and boulevards for exit. Not the way a platform works. Here, your boundaries can overlap. Your competitors can be complementers. You focus on those core interactions that generate network effects, and you focus on demand-side economies of scale as much as supply economies of scale. Now, your community is the asset, not just the physical assets. You've got to manage and lead those communities. You work on engagement and value creation. And notice, access is now permissionless entry of production and consumption. We flipped it 180 degrees, and it's quite the opposite. It's not barriers to entry for competitors. It's frictionless entry, permissionless entry for production and consumption, and innovations by the firm and by the ecosystem. And it affects everything. It affects finance, HR, R&D, strategy, marketing, ops, IT. Every single one of the functions of the firm takes on an external counterpart. Again, the insight, so it doesn't really matter. If you look at IT, it's gone from back office systems to front office systems to out of office social systems. If you look at marketing, it's push to pull, outbound to inbound. Strategy, entry barriers, internal resources to frictionless entry. On human resources, internal employees to external wisdom of crowds. Again, the insight is innovation takes place based on these network effects of users creating value for users. This scales outside the firm better than inside the firm. We can see this across a number of different industries. The car is going to be a platform. Blockchain and finance will be a platform, transitioning the banking industries. Governments will become platforms. We had an interesting case in Boston only 2 years ago where we had 3 meters of snow suddenly appear in 1 month, breaking all records. The city couldn't expand. We need elastic services where citizens can actually provide some of those services. This will be possible on platforms. The Internet of Things will become a platform. Energy and smart grids with trading and energy markets will also be a platform. Architecture and business information modules also as platform. Education, we faculty, academics are also going on with online MOOCs as platforms. And of course, healthcare is another area that will also be transformed to platform by information and community. So I wanted to leave you with a couple of ideas. One of them, platforms beat products every time. Even a weak platform will beat a strong product because it out-innovates, and a platform gets better through use in a way that a product does not. The real issue here is demand economies of scale, or these network effects that are different than supply economies of scale from the industrial era of the past. This is creating new monopolies like those of the supply side, but we have to manage the demand side differently. The business models differ because this is causing a firm inversion. We have to create as much value outside the firm as we're creating inside the firm, and the orchestration of those processes matter. We can also predict new classes of competitors, not just based on the features of a given product, but based on the tight relationship with the community. Again, the technology matters less than the community. And lastly, information and community are the critical resources. We need these communities, we need to bring them in, we need to lead these communities and build them over time. Communities create the margins, the innovations, and they add the stickiness over time. So with that, I'm delighted to take further questions on it, and really thank you for your time.